Hello there, and thanks for tuning in to what is our seventh episode of season three of Raising the Roof. I'm Nick Atkin, and you're listening to the podcast that brings together business leaders and industry experts to unpick the hot topics, not just in housing, but much further than that. And today we're talking about a subject that's impacted all of us at some point in our lives, and that's change. As they say, the only constant in life is change. So whether it's at work, whether it's our personal lives, change is always with us. And someone who knows that much better than most is our guest for this episode, Melanie Franklin, who's recognised around the world as a leader in change management. And not just recognised around the world, but also lives around the world. She's based in Malaga and also London. And Mel has the privilege of describing herself as working for fun. And that's because she's dedicated the last 20 or so years of her career to communicating some of the key drivers for change and helping organizations make that transition. But she's got loads of spare time, so she's also authored several publications and also is a regular keynote speaker at conferences. And her day job, she's director of Agile Change Management and founder of the Continuous Change Community. So, Mel, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Raising the Roof.
Thank you very much.
So, obviously, you've had a really, really exciting career. You've had lots of change yourself. And I always try to understand things by comparing what happens in what I call my real life at home. So let's try and approach change in that way. If for no other reason, it's the only way I can understand things. So, but the biggest change, I suppose, in my life was when each of my kiddywinkles were born. I've had the joy of having three of them go through that process. And I think any parent would probably say that nothing ever prepares you for having kids. And the one moment I always remember that hits me in terms of change is that moment when you get back from the hospital and you close the front door. And I suppose any parents listening will know now exactly what I mean by that. But suddenly you just think, my life has changed beyond any recognition. What happened before is a completely different point in time to what's now in front of me. So, Mel, do you want to kick off? What's been the biggest change in your life, just before we start getting into the mechanics of how to manage change?
I think I would have to pick from the last few years is that in 2018, I thought about moving to Spain because I was working. I used to get on the 6:30 from Woking to the City of London, and I used to leave maybe 7, 8 o'clock at night because I do love my job, but it meant I wasn't really seeing any daylight. And there was a trigger point. I was in the walkie-talkie building, and a client came and stood beside me as I was looking out over the Thames on a very grey day in April. This was 2019. And he said to me, "We haven't had a cloud-free day since October the 10th." Now, he's a statistician, and when he says
Wow.
things like that, I believe him. So I thought, really, it's been over 6 months of it's always been cloudy and a bit grey. And I thought, that's it. I'm going. And I did that change in a very agile way, in that I thought, this is massive, a new country, a whole new life. I've got my, what, he's now 90, but at the time I had my 85-year-old father I was looking after. So, and I had an elderly Labrador, and I thought, we can do this, do this. And so what we did was I took him to a Place in the Sun exhibition. He was looking at jasmine. I went to the lawyers' meetings, and they basically said, it's Brexit, you've got until December to do this, or you can't do it, really. So I thought, well, that galvanized me. So in May, I booked us a little holiday. I brought my best friend, my godsons, and we went and stayed for a week, and I went house hunting, and I rented somewhere for a year from the September. And so we moved in a very agile way. I said, I don't know if we'll like it. You might not like it. I might not like it, but let's rent for a year. So I rented out my own flat, and we came down here. And again, very agile way was that I drove my Labrador down, bought one of my
Oh,
godsons, and I drove my Labrador down for 3 days at the end of August and arrived on the 1st of September. My dad flew down a couple of days before, stayed in a hotel, and he met me on the 1st of September. I had some carers ready to look after him, covering most of the week. And basically, I had a week off, and then I got back to work. So
wow.
I was flying all over the world before COVID. I would fly every week somewhere different. and I would come home at weekends. So I did it in a very agile way because actually it was all uncertain and I didn't want to sort of commit to something that I didn't really understand. So I thought I'll do the
Oh,
change incrementally and see where it takes me. And 5 years later, I bought a house. I have a wonderful new husband and have a pretty good life.
that sounds like an absolute masterclass in how to move home and relocate to another country. So thanks for that, Mel. Can I just ask you about your dad? Because do we become more resistant to change with age, or is that just a lazy assumption? So, as he was then, your 85-year-old dad, now 90. How did he cope with that change? Because, the weather's different, the language is different, all those sorts of things. How did you sort of see that change and him manage that change? And is there a difference with age or not?
Well, I think we can't generalize and say as you get older, you become more resistant to change. But one of the things we can say is that as you get older, you have more experiences. And in some cases, this will make you realize that actually you're more change averse because you've got a history of things that maybe didn't work out. So you become more
Ah,
hesitant
yeah.
because you think, oh, actually, I've got all this wealth of examples where it didn't work. Other people would have exactly the opposite. And they would say, well, I've got all this wealth of experience where I've tried stuff and nothing went that badly wrong. So let's try some more things. What we have to look at with age is we have to look at experience and think, well, actually, somebody's coming to the table with a wealth of experience, and it's how they interpret that experience will make them more or less open to change. Because some people will go, what's the worst that can happen? I might die. Well, I'm 87. It's amazing I'm still here. Other people will go, I want to protect what little time I've got left with every ounce of my brain. So I'm not going to change. So I think it comes down to experience and go, well, let's try it. What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, and it's interesting that about change because I've got relatives in Australia, and there's a saying in Australia that getting old is a privilege and a gift, and actually, it should be something that's embraced. So you're right about the experiences. Really interesting point on that. Not all of our listeners will know the different approaches to managing change. You've referenced their agile change, and there are lots of technical theories to help guide businesses and individuals through growth and also uncertain times. So, can you just give us a really brief overview, like a dummy's guide, really, to change management, the most popular approaches, and your sort of reflections on why it's so important to have a clear direction or a clear methodology to take colleagues through that?
Well, if I use the example of moving country, I have two choices. I can do it as a big bang approach. Sometimes that's called a waterfall approach, where we
Yeah,
gather all the requirements and all of the understanding up front. And then we basically go through every single activity needed to create that complete solution, that complete picture. And only then do we go live, do we do it? So if I had moved to Spain using that more big bang waterfall approach, then what I would have done is I would have already viewed a load of properties. I would have decided exactly where it was I was living. I would have got my car sorted. I would have done all the paperwork from the UK. I would have had everything in a row and then I would have moved there. I would not have picked stuff up every weekend. I would have had all the movers come in and move everything. Every single requirement related to living in a new country would have been dealt with before I moved. And at that point,
fine.
I will have shifted. Whereas with an agile approach, we talk about doing things in an iterative or incremental way. I do a little bit, get the feedback, see how that's going, and then build on that. What else do I need? So, what we're doing is deciding, do I work it all out up front and just go live once? Or do I do a little bit, experience that, and then do the next little bit and experience that? Those are your two choices, really. And the differentiator between them is certainty. If I had known every aspect of living in a new country and knew everything that I wanted, then I could have done it in a waterfall approach and I could have made lots of lists and lots of plans. But I didn't. So I just had to roll with it. Do a little bit. I rented my house. I had somewhere to go. I drove my car down so I had a car to begin with. So I did it in that more iterative way because planning in the detailed planning up front and doing a complete solution would not fit in a world where I just didn't know exactly what was required.
Yeah. How about getting colleagues on board? So here at Yorkshire Housing, we recently moved to an agile change management approach. So we previously were more big bang waterfall type stuff, and that for a number of reasons didn't work as well for us. But I have to confess, it took me a while to get my head around it, because there are some of those things that you're hardwired to expect, like, a Gantt chart with like when things are going to happen and an end date and all those sort of things that, so stepping into this slightly more uncertain, slightly more fluid world can be quite disconcerting.
Feels
So,
risky because I
yeah,
can't give you a step-by-step plan. The secret of that approach, in fact, it's the same for both, but the most important thing is you talk about the destination, not the journey. This is
right,
where we're trying to get to. So I'm working with a medical devices company at the moment that want to look after people that are dealing with sight loss. So they're thinking about a better clinical experience for them, and that's their end goal.
is that what you do? You help organizations navigate a way through this and understand what that sort of end picture will look like?
And I help a lot of people from senior leadership level to everybody who's involved. I think the one thing that unifies that approach is, how do you create a journey planner? So I help people work out what the end goal is. And at your level, I would be thinking a more strategic vision of that. But then I take that onto every department within an organization and say, okay, so what does that end goal now look like for you? What's your bit of the bigger end goal? And for every single version of that, we then work back from it and go, okay, well, how can we chunk that up then? So by the end of this year, you've already said you're going to be using Salesforce. So we'll be
Yeah.
thinking about how we are managing our customer engagement. It might be some of the reporting and the data that we collect. So we start to think whether you're talking about those who are dealing with the maintenance of your homes or those directly onboarding new tenants. Everybody's going to have a slightly different experience of Salesforce. So, okay, fine. What do you need to do? Let's work out what are the steps on that journey. And then let's work out for the first step you've got to get to, what are the things you want to do? Don't worry about the things you need to do to get the second step. We'll get there when we've done the first step. So
Yeah.
it's working in that way, but it always starts with, what's your end goal? What's the ultimate destination you're trying to get to? It's like layers of an onion. Take the first layer, deliver on that, then the next,
Okay.
then the next, and then you'll get to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. That's really, really good advice. I'll have the image of that onion in my mind the next time we're talking through our Salesforce and our wider change journey. Your example of moving home was really interesting. You referenced a couple of things during that. You talked about Brexit and you talked about COVID. And so, as a world, we've been through some quite seismic changes in a relatively short period of time. So, we've had a global pandemic. We've obviously had a completely different change in relationship with our trading partners. Now in the UK, we've also got a new government. There's lots and lots of change. But I think COVID is, for me, was the real turbocharger for change in how people work. So we've got a much more dispersed workforce. It's much more fluid in how people work, where people work, when people work. And that's come with great benefits, certainly for us here at Yorkshire Housing. It means we've been able to recruit and attract people from literally all over the UK and across the world, interestingly. I've got several colleagues that are based in London. We've got colleagues in the Netherlands, all over the place. But the problem with that is that you don't have people together in the way that you did pre-2020. So from your perspective, how's that affected the management of change? And I'm also interested in terms of just how much of a change in itself has it been for you to deal with?
When I was writing the new book, which is my 10th, which made me feel very old,
Wow.
I did the Agile Change Management Handbook, and I've done a couple of editions of that because it's so popular. But now I've done neuroscience for change at work. And one of the things I said when I was working with my co-author is, I know that there's scientific research, I'll accept that, but I don't want to see any management examples from before COVID, because actually there was a watershed and we are now in a much more hybrid world. First of all, I can find myself now working with a team where I've got somebody who in San Francisco I work with very regularly, but I do have to be willing, I think, to be flexible. I
Yeah.
can't say, well, I work 9 to 5 in the UK time zone. I mean,
Uh,
that just closes out lots of people. So I think that's number one. Neuroscientifically, The other thing that I'm aware of is that as human beings, we orientate towards the faces of other humans. That's how we start to build relationships. The mirror
Okay.
neurons, we're watching each other as we talk on this conversation. So having cameras on is absolutely vital because it's actually a key part of our communication as a human being. And the other thing I'm interested in is how do I build that chemical in the brain called oxytocin, which is all about bonding and trust. Because I'm interested in the fact that if I trust you, now we spent 20, 30 minutes having a chat before we started this
Yeah,
podcast.
we
We
did.
started to
Yeah.
get to know each other. We found points of interest. And therefore, we both started, although we didn't notice it in our brains, we started to go, oh, he's part of my tribe. She's part of my tribe. She sees the world similarly to me. Therefore, I am more likely to trust what she says. I'm less likely to criticize it. I'm less likely to be defensive.
Yeah.
We have to remember that we need to build in some of that socializing time. What you're going to find is your productivity goes up
Yeah.
because you're much quicker to collaborate, to share information, be more transparent. I think leadership has got so much harder. It is much more difficult than when we were just face to face, because the thing that's different is that I can't have my accidental social engagement with you. I might be standing in the canteen making a cup of tea in the morning. We have a brief chat. We don't see each other for another couple of weeks, but then another time we pass each other in the corridor. All of that's gone out the window.
Yeah.
So we need to be more deliberate in our engagement. One of the things that I've said to my clients, because of my own experiences about, as I understand how the brain works, I want to be smarter. So I say to myself, right, I'm going to go and work at a colleague's house. I don't do it very often, but every month or so, I might go over and sit with her at her house. So we can do some face-to-face time. And what I need to recognize is that there is transactional productivity and social productivity. Transactional productivity is me getting up early, getting at my desk, getting articles written, writing new training courses, writing chapters of books, all of the stuff that I have to do to run
Yeah.
a change management consultancy. Social productivity is when I'm actually building bonds, I'm sharing knowledge, catching up with what I've been doing, listening to my colleague about what she's been doing, what challenges, what she's worried about, what successes she's had. You've got to value it. That's what's different, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I concur with what you say about leadership in a post-COVID world. It is about making those what I call unstructured sort of conversations and just making time to drift around. So can I just flip that around though? One of the things I do on social media is I try and follow people whose views I don't agree with because I think that helps extend my learning and my thinking. Because I very often sort of think to myself, why is it that I feel really strongly against those views? And I don't mean the obvious sort of, really, really abhorrent views, but just people's opinions differ, don't they? So do you need to guard against just surrounding yourself with people who you have bonded with? How do you make sure you've got that balance? And do you need
I
that
think
balance?
I think you do. I think, but it goes to a fundamental in a world that's changing very fast. Maybe one of the greatest qualities I'm looking for whenever I employ somebody as well is curiosity,
Right.
questioning.
Yeah.
And you're just giving an example of your curiosity is by following people with different views. You're curious about what their views are and where they've come from. And I think there's something about getting in the habit of trying to stay out of judgment. A psychologist taught me this years ago, but it's played very well for me, which is when somebody's saying something that you don't immediately agree with, what our brains want to do is label it. The amount of information that comes into our brain every nanosecond is way more than we can process. So the brain quickly filters things. By doing that, it labels things good, bad, right, wrong. And we deal with the stuff we like and we deal with the stuff we agree with. So by staying curious, we're sort of widening it out. And the best way to do that is instead of letting your brain automatically label something, you hear something and instead of going, oh, that's stupid, I'm going to ignore it, you go, that's different. What's the basis
Yeah.
of that then? I have two go-tos. When I'm hearing something, I try immediately in my head, I hear the words, that's interesting. Because interesting keeps it open, keeps me curious, rather than that's wrong. So I think it's that genuine ability to train your brain to do that, to say that's interesting, keeps you less judgmental, less defensive, and much more curious, and therefore open and flexible. I work with different cultures, different religions. And to say that there's only one way of seeing the world, just it doesn't play out like that. In my home life, I've had the same experience. My partner is very much a night owl, and I am very much an early bird.
Yeah.
And instead of me going, "You're wrong, you should get up early and get stuff done," it's actually training my brain to go, right, he actually comes to life about 10 o'clock in the morning. By
Yeah.
then, I may have been in the office for 3 hours.
Yeah.
But it's each other valuing that that's, first of all, what our natural programming is like, but also seeing the world from a different perspective. So finding that and admiring it rather than trying to criticize it.
Yeah, I absolutely get that. I'm like you. I'm a real early person, and I know there are some of my colleagues who I won't bother even communicating with them this side of midday because they're nowhere near. It's about how you get the best out of people, isn't it? And if they are a night owl or a later person, knowing that, why don't you utilize that to ensure that you're tailoring your approach to get the best out of them? So
I think it plays into change as well, because you might want to get to that end goal. You might have that clear destination. But I think over 30 years of learning has taught me that the most important thing is to ask, don't tell.
yeah.
Because if I ask you, how do you think we should make this change? What do you think the benefits are? What actions can you take to make the change? Then we'll dig into the detail that's relevant to your job, to your perspective. That's
Yeah, it
what's
is.
really
It's,
important to
it's
me.
about knowing the individual, isn't it, and tailoring your approach accordingly. So you've talked about the experience that you've had, and I think it's fair to say not everyone gets change right, and most companies struggle at some point with the process and are genuinely tested during those transformational periods. Have you got any good examples of when change has or hasn't been done right? Any sort of tips or tricks in terms of that you've seen that have worked well or that, pitfalls to avoid?
I've got a couple of examples. I'm going to talk about maybe what great looks like. As I think there was one UK charity, their chief operating officer was really clever at the very beginning. And he does this on all the changes. That what he did was he realized that actually the change, they were moving from charity to being a charity and a lobbying organization for the people suffering the illness that they had. So what he recognized was that there's a lot of things to do, major program of transformation, as we might call it. Actually, there's a change we need to do before that. What can we do to slim down what we're doing now? What can we get rid of? What can we dismantle, remove obsolete processes to create enough space for us to consider the change? And
Yeah,
I'm thinking of a bank where I sat in the boardroom where the CEO went round to each of the directors and basically said, "What are you cutting this year? Because we've got this transformation to do." The directors who fail are the ones that make this assumption that there's an ever expanding working day. And there isn't. Everybody who's listening to this podcast is in the same boat. I
yeah,
guarantee they're working at about 130% of their contract hours, because maybe they come in late, or maybe they skip lunch, or they work late. I see, because I work around the world, that I see my LinkedIn traffic and my email traffic on a Saturday morning with people
yeah,
who are trying just to finish off from the week. And I see other groups who come in on a Sunday afternoon, Sunday
yeah,
evening, particularly
yeah,
Sunday evening, and going, "We need to get this sorted, ready for the week ahead." So we have
yeah,
people who are absolutely up to the maximum. So excellence is about recognizing we need to create the space, the time to be able to change, not just focus on what the change is. There was another organization, they're in the public sector, where what they did was recognize that there's so much change. Maybe one of the things we really ought to do is what we tend to talk about as portfolio management. But basically, let's create a catalogue of all the changes that are going on. Let's try and track them all so that we don't overload people. Well, don't overload them that much. We are going to overload people because of the volume of change. I don't know any organization in this world that has as many resources as it has the ambition. So make the time for change, know all the changes that are happening, and don't overload people. But I think there's an overarching excellence for senior leaders that actually all staff need, which is that it's the recognition that we want to get a lot of benefits out of whatever change we're making. You are going to digitize with Salesforce.com, and I'm sure you've got lots of other transformations going on. You want data accuracy, data security gains you want to get out. So those are the benefits you're going for. And if you just see the change in the realm of those benefits, then I think you will fail. Any organization will fail, because actually successful change is made up of two things. It's made up of the achievement of the change, the benefits from that change, plus the experience during the change. If staff have a poor experience, one of two things, or maybe both happen. Number one, there's a good chance they will decide to leave. So you have a staff churn and a talent acquisition problem that you never wanted. But you are also massively shooting yourself in the foot. This isn't the only change you're going to make happen. So why would you set an environment where you have fed organizational cynicism because they had such a bad experience pushing this change through that the next change you announce, everyone's going to go, nope, not doing it. I'm going to ignore it. Let me keep my head in the sand and just hope they forget about it. Or you're going to have to spend a lot more time convincing people to get on board, reassuring people that it's not going to be a problem, when you actually drill something through so fast and so hard last time that you cause so much uproar that nobody believes you. So there has to be a balance between achievement and experience. That is where excellence sits.
I don't hear many people talk about the focus on the experience of the change process. That experiencing, though, just completely gets lost. I've never heard that talked about before. So that is absolutely fascinating. You've given us loads of advice, but if you were to boil it down, what are the top 3 tips, say, for successfully delivering change?
I think the first thing, which is it's about people. We can talk about the scope of the change, we can have a plan for the change, but change only becomes a reality when everybody who has to actually says, "We'll give it a go. Let's try it." And so they are prepared to take that step. So what is it that we're doing to support them with that? So the first thing is recognize that change only happens if individual humans are willing to take a chance and try something, and you've got to give them the time to keep practicing and the materials, the support package. It might be training and coaching, it could be user guides, it could be just a quiet time to do it, but how they practice. Because the other thing to think about is that change becomes its habit. So I haven't changed if I've done something once but not repeated it. I'm moving from an existing routine or habit to I need to build a new routine or habit. We know habits are about repeating something until it becomes just, oh, it's just, this is how I do it. It's the new norm.
I think the application of neuroscience and in terms of the management of change has been fascinating. It's an angle I always subconsciously knew was there, but you've really brought it to the fore, and it's just been an absolutely fascinating discussion to sort of take us on a bit of a journey through that. So I'm definitely going to pick this up and do a little bit more work on it after this podcast. So
I think there's so much change going on and people are under so much pressure that what I can't do is afford to waste their time by sending out bland emails or trying to push the scope of the change or my change plan on them. What I need
uh,
is to be able to communicate in a way that makes their brain go, yeah,
yeah,
that's good.
yeah, I feel like I spend much more time selling and convincing than I ever used to have to. That's in a good way. I'd rather take people on the journey and to absolutely buy in and be convinced of the reason for the journey. But I think that's definitely been one of the major changes I've had to adapt to over the last sort of 4 to 5 years. And if you look at how that's affected our organization, we've grown our comms and engagement team as well to support the delivery of that. So absolutely fascinating. It's been great. It's now the bit that I always get slightly nervous about, which is a new feature we've brought in for season 3. It's flip the mic. So it's over to you, Mel, and it's your opportunity to ask me a couple of questions. So fire away.
So I did actually have a couple of questions, because as far as neuroscience is concerned, I also think about artificial intelligence. The question I have is, what are you doing to upskill yourself to know enough to have an opinion on artificial intelligence?
Oh, that is a good question. On our last podcast, we had Guy Marshall, who's got a PhD in artificial intelligence, but for me is probably the best person I've come across who absolutely just makes artificial intelligence make sense. What he sort of said was, if you're trying to keep up with this, if you think you're going to be a subject matter expert, then you're kidding yourself. There's 300 plus publications that are coming out every month. And the rate of change of AI is exponential. So, the ability of humans and the human brain to be able to process all of what's out there and what's coming is limited. However, what you can do is think about how you could make use of AI and also surround yourselves with people with the right mindset. Going back to your point before about having an open mind and asking questions and being curious about, could it do this? Could it help us with this? Because certainly my vision and my view of AI is that I think it will transform our business. I think it will transform most businesses across the world, but I think it will transform our business for the better. I think it will remove some of the mundane processes that some of our colleagues endure. But actually, to use that AI to remove the processes, not so that we can reduce costs or reduce headcount, but actually so that we can then use those people for the things that you talked about before, about that interaction with other humans, our customers, each other, and actually have more value add as a result of us creating more time and space, I suppose, going back to again to a point you talked about. So for me, I never ever try to claim I'm a subject matter expert or that I'm up to date on X or Y.
I've got one more question for you though. You mentioned
Okay.
Salesforce. Now you're the CEO. So the question for many change people who might be listening to this is, what is it that you are doing to demonstrate that you are also going to be using Salesforce, because you're asking all of your staff to start using salesforce.com?
It's a great question again. And I think for me, the biggest word I think that leadership needs in 2024, 2025 is authentic, being authentic. So you've got to be prepared to do what other people are doing. You've got to understand what it is they're dealing with. I spend a lot of time out and about with colleagues, not in some, fresh wet paint type environment where I rock up and everything looks wonderful. But actually, it's about spending time with people and understanding some of the pressures that they're facing and some of the issues that the organization, that all organizations create, that you just look at and you go, why are we doing that? That's absolutely bonkers. And the beauty of my position is, I'm very privileged in that I'm able to then make some changes that impact positively on our colleagues' lives and quality of work, but also that improves our customer service. It became very apparent to me very early on in my time at Yorkshire Housing that it was a miracle we were able to deliver any services, because at the moment we're using 12 different systems, none of which communicate with each other. And it's our colleagues that paper over the cracks and enable, generally from a customer point of view, generally things work pretty smoothly. Like everything, there's always hiccups along the way. But I then think, well, actually, imagine how much easier some of those jobs and responsibilities are going to be for colleagues once we get down that Salesforce route. But it's like any piece of software, it's just a platform. It'll just deliver and it'll just process information. The important thing for us is how we utilize that to create real added value that impacts positively on our customers' lives.
So you're going to be logging in too, and you're going to be looking at the
I'll
data.
I'll be logged in. Don't worry. They're keeping me out at the moment for some reason, but we're on the very early stages. So Mel, thanks for that. I just want to wrap things up with just a couple of quick fire questions. So first of all, what would be your one key message to getting change right in the workplace?
Maximize on the experience, not just on the benefits that you're going for the individual change. That way you build an ongoing capability for change and you minimize organizational cynicism.
Okay, and I definitely took that away from earlier. That's my big takeaway from today. I think the second question I had was a bit more philosophical. What's the one thing you'd change in the world right now?
I think let's be less judgmental, less
Yeah.
critical, but I think it goes to a wider piece around very much. I've studied the school of positive psychology, and it's the what we call the effect heuristic. Our brains make decisions on our overall emotional state. So if we choose to look at things in a negative way, and if we feed off of we criticize that, we see that problem, we see that difficulty, then all we can think about are all the things that are going wrong and how hard things are. And it becomes a nasty, vicious circle. Alternatively, I'm going to put down my laptop in a moment and I'm actually going to say there are a lot of things I didn't get done today. And I feel like I've been chasing my tail all day. But actually, I'm going to close down the laptop lid and I'm going to go, but actually, I delivered that paper this morning. I did that agenda for that other event. I did this webinar. I delivered a course today. I'm going to focus on what I did get done so that I walk away feeling happier, more positive, because then I'm open to opportunities. I'm open to new ideas rather than closing them down.
That sounds like a mega productive day to me, so I wouldn't be overly critical if I were you. Well, let me help you close that laptop because the sands of time have once again slipped by. So I'm afraid it's time to close the door on this episode of the podcast. I do want to say a huge thank you to you, Mel, for sharing your insight and some absolute top tips for managing change. But also a big thank you to all of you out there who are listening. And just one final ask from me. I hope you'll join me for another episode of Raising the Roof. To do so, please hit the subscribe button from wherever you get your podcasts. But until next time, goodbye.